The night I finally understood that my parents would always choose my brother over me did not arrive with shouting, or slammed doors or cruel words spoken out loud. It arrived quietly, sitting across from me at a dinner table in California, surrounded by plates of food that grew cold while everyone celebrated a life that was never mine. And in that silence, something inside me broken away that never healed the same again. I am Natalie, and for most of my life, I was the child who learned early how to disappear without leaving the room. I learned how to smile while being overlooked, how to nod while my achievements passed unnoticed, and how to shrink myself so that the family balance could remain undisturbed. I was not unloved in obvious ways. I was neglected in ways that were easier to deny and harder to survive. If someone had asked my parents whether they treated their children differently, they would have laughed and said they loved us equally. What they never saw or never wanted to see was how love expressed unevenly leaves marks that never fade. I grew up in California in a home that looked peaceful from the outside, with trimmed lawns, holiday decorations every year, and family photos framed carefully on the walls. Inside those frames, my brother Evan always stood closer to the center. Evan was younger than me, louder than me, and endlessly protected. He was the child whose mistakes were explained away, whose failures were softened, and whose presence commanded attention without effort. From childhood, everything in our home revolved around him, his moods, his plans, and his future, while I learned to exist quietly on the edges. Our parents, Linda and Robert, never called it favoritism. They called it understanding. Evan needed more support, they said. Evan struggled more, they said. Evan was sensitive, they said. What they never said was that I was expected to carry myself without support, without reassurance, and without complaint. Strength was assigned to me like a duty, not praised as a quality. If I succeeded, it was expected. If I endured, it was assumed. If I hurt, it was invisible. From a young age, I understood that family dinners were not places of connection for me. They were performances where I played the role of the agreeable daughter who listened while others spoke. Evan's stories filled the air, even when those stories were about plans that never materialized or ideas that never lasted. My parents leaned forward when he spoke, offering encouragement and advice, while I sat back, waiting for a moment that rarely came. When I shared something about my own life, it was acknowledged briefly and then set aside as if it were a footnote rather than a chapter. Vacations followed the same pattern. Plans were made around Evan's schedule, Evan's preferences, Evan's moods. If a trip conflicted with my responsibilities or goals, I was expected to adjust quietly. When I did adjust, no one noticed. When I hesitated, I was reminded that family meant compromise, though that compromise never seemed to move in my direction. I learned that my absence was easier to accommodate than Evan's discomfort, and that lesson settled deep into my bones. Holidays were no different. Birthdays were celebrated loudly for Evan, even when he accomplished little, while mine passed with polite acknowledgement and minimal effort. Family gatherings placed him at the center of attention, laughing and receiving praise, while I drifted between rooms, helping in the background, cleaning up, making sure everyone else was comfortable. I became useful rather than valued, dependable rather than cherished. What hurt the most was not that my parents loved Evan. It was that they never noticed how often they chose him and how often they left me standing alone in the aftermath of those choices. When Evan failed at something, it became a family concern. When I succeeded, it became a personal responsibility. Their expectations of me were higher, not because they believed in me more, but because they believed I could endure more. As I moved into adulthood, the pattern followed me. Evan's struggles became excuses for continued support, while my independence became justification for emotional distance. I paid my way, handled my responsibilities, and never asked for help. Partly because I did not want to burden anyone, and partly because I already knew the answer. I watched as Evan moved from one unfinished plan to another, always cushioned by our parents' patience, while I built my life quietly, step by step, without applause. The dinner that changed everything did not appear important at first. It was an ordinary family gathering, the kind we had countless times before. We sat around the table, familiar faces, familiar patterns. Evan spoke about a new idea, another plan that sounded impressive, but lacked substance. My parents listened, with enthusiasm, offering encouragement, not because I believed in the idea. At some point, I mentioned my own progress, something I had worked toward for years. In that moment, something shifted inside me. I saw the pattern clearly, without denial or hope softening its edges. I realized that no matter what I achieved, I would never be the child they chose first. That realization did not make me angry immediately. It made me tired, in a way I had never felt before. Tired of waiting, tired of adjusting, tired of proving that I deserved space at a table that was never truly mine. I understood then that continuing to seek recognition from people who did not see me was costing me more than it was giving. In the months that followed, I began to withdraw not out of bitterness, but out of self-preservation. I stopped attending every dinner. I declined vacations that required me to minimize myself. I focused on building a future that did not depend on approval that never came. When I pursued and secured a government job, it was not glamorous, but it was stable, dignified, and earned entirely on my own. It represented something my family had never given me consistently, which was security without conditions. My absence went largely unnoticed at first. Evan still occupied the center of attention. My parents still revolved around him. But something important had changed, even if they did not see it yet. I was no longer waiting to be chosen. I was choosing myself. I makes a quiet decision in my heart, a decision to step away from the role I had been assigned, and to build a life where my worth was not measured by comparison. What my family did not understand yet was that favoritism does not only damage the child who is overlooked, it also teaches that child how to leave without looking back, stronger, calmer, and finally free. Walking away from my family was not a single dramatic moment. It was a slow, deliberate untying of knots that had been tightening around my chest since childhood. After that dinner, after the quiet realization that I would never be chosen first, I stopped hoping that things would change. Instead, I began changing myself, not by becoming colder or crueler, but by becoming distant, in a way that protected my sanity. I still lived in California, close enough that I could have stayed involved if I wanted to. Distance was never the barrier. Choice was. For the first time, I began choosing where my energy went, and my family was no longer at the top of that list. I reduced my visits. I stopped calling first. I answered messages when I felt ready, not out of obligation. At first, it felt unnatural, like stepping outside without armor. But slowly, the silence became peaceful instead of painful. My government job became my anchor. It was not flashy, and it did not come with applause or admiration from my parents. But it gave me something far more important. It gave me structure, respect, and a sense of earned independence. Every morning, I woke up knowing that my progress depended on my discipline, not on anyone's approval. I worked hard, learned quickly, and built a reputation for reliability and integrity. My supervisors noticed. My colleagues trusted me. In that professional space, I was not compared to anyone else. I was evaluated on my own merit, and that alone felt revolutionary. While my life grew quieter, my family remained loud in the same familiar ways. Evan continued to drift. One idea replaced another, each one introduced with enthusiasm. and defended with excuses when it failed. My parents remained his safety net, emotionally and financially. They worried about him constantly, spoke about him endlessly, and adjusted their lives to accommodate his instability. When I visited occasionally, I could feel the imbalance immediately, like walking into a room where the air was heavier on one side. Family gatherings did not improve with distance. In some ways, they became worse. My absence had turned me into an afterthought. When I did show up, conversations still revolved around Evan's struggles, Evan's plans, Evan's needs. I sat through dinners where my accomplishments were summarized quickly, while Evan's failures were dissected, with concern and sympathy. No one asked how it felt to carry myself alone for so long. No one noticed how much effort it took to remain composed. Holidays were especially revealing. Invitations arrived late or vaguely, as if my presence was optional. Vacations were planned without considering. My schedule then mentioned casually, as if I might join if it was convenient. When I declined, no one pressed. When Evan hesitated, plans were rearranged. The contrast was so clear that it stopped hurting and started educating me. I was learning exactly where I stood. And that knowledge, while painful, was also freeing. What surprised me most was how my parents interpreted my independence. Instead of seeing it as strength, they used it as justification. Natalie is fine, they said. Natalie does not need much, they said. Natalie understands, they said. Understanding in their language meant accepting less. It meant continuing to make room for Evan while shrinking myself further. I realized then that my maturity had become their excuse. As months passed, I began to notice cracks forming on the other side. Evan's failures were no longer isolated incidents. They were patterns. Opportunities slipped away. Support did not lead to growth. My parents' constant rescuing prevented him from learning responsibility. Stress crept into their voices. Frustration surfaced in private moments, though never openly acknowledged. Still, the favoritism did not disappear. It simply became heavier, more exhausting. I stayed focused on my path. I took additional certifications related to my job. I built savings quietly. I invested in myself emotionally, learning how to sit with loneliness without mistaking it for failure. Some nights were hard. There were moments when I wished someone would ask me to come home. Not out of convenience, but out of genuine desire. Those moments passed. I reminded myself that being missed by people who never truly saw me was not the same as being loved. One evening during a rare visit, I noticed something that would have shattered me years earlier. Evan complained openly about how unfair life had been to him, how things never worked out, how pressure weighed on him. My parents listened, nodding, comforting. I watched quietly, not with resentment, but with clarity. He had been protected from discomfort for so long that he had never learned how to stand on his own. I had been left to stand alone, so often that I no longer feared it. That night, driving back to my own place, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for the family dynamic that never changed, and relief that I no longer needed it to. I understood that favoritism had shaped both of us in different ways, and neither outcome was healthy. But only one of us was learning to survive without leaning on others. The distance between me and my family grew, not because I pushed them away, but because I stopped chasing them. My parents noticed eventually. Comments surfaced about how busy I was, how independent I had become. There was pride in their tone, but still no curiosity about the cost. They did not ask what it took to build my life alone. They did not see the nights of doubt, the years of quiet effort, the strength forged in neglect. Now I was standing firmly on my own ground, no longer waiting for validation that never arrived. I was becoming someone my younger self needed, someone steady, self-reliant, and unafraid of solitude. What I did not know yet was that the Same favoritism that pushed me away was setting my family on a collision course, with consequences they could not avoid. And when those consequences arrived, they would finally look for the daughter they had always taken for granted. By the time my family truly noticed my absence, it had already reshaped me. I did not announce my distance. I did not send dramatic messages or demand explanations. I simply stopped orbiting around their expectations. Months passed, then years, and in that quiet stretch of time, my life solidified into something steady and self-contained. I moved into a better apartment closer to my workplace, one that reflected my taste rather than compromise. My government job evolved from a position into a career. Responsibilities increased, trust deepened, and my name began to carry weight in rooms where decisions mattered. Meanwhile, my family's world began to wobble. At first, the signs were subtle. Evan switched directions again, abandoning one plan for another, with the same restless confidence he had always carried. Only now, the safety net felt thinner. My parents were aging, their energy no longer endless, their patience no longer effortless. Supporting Evan was no longer just emotional. It was draining them financially and mentally, though they would never admit it openly. They continued to protect him from consequences, believing love meant shielding him from discomfort, even as that discomfort grew sharper. Family gatherings became infrequent, then strained. When I did attend, the atmosphere felt different. Conversations paused when I entered, as if my presence reminded them of something unresolved. I noticed how my parents looked at me now, not with the casual assurance they once had, but with something closer to uncertainty. I was no longer the predictable daughter who would always be fine. I had become independent in a way that could not be easily dismissed. They began asking questions, carefully at first. How was work? Was I still enjoying my job? Did I plan to stay in California long term? Each question carried an unspoken realization. I was building a life that did not revolve around them, and they were no longer central to my story. That shift unsettled them more than any argument ever could have. Evan noticed it too, though his response was different. His confidence turned brittle. He compared himself to me in ways he never had before, measuring his stalled progress against my quiet stability. I sensed resentment growing beneath his casual remarks, an awareness that the roles we had been assigned were no longer holding. The favored child was faltering. The overlooked one was thriving. One evening, during a tense family dinner, the imbalance finally cracked. My parents spoke openly about stress, about finances, about worry for the future. Evan grew defensive, blaming circumstances, timing, bad luck. I listened without interruption, observing how the dynamic had shifted. For the first time, they were not looking at him with unquestioning faith. They were tired. And for the first time, they looked at me, not as the low-maintenance daughter, but as the stable one. That realization did not feel triumphant. It felt heavy. They began leaning on me emotionally, seeking advice, reassurance, perspective. The same parents who once assumed I would manage on my own now wanted help carry their worry. I offered measured support, but I did not step back into old patterns. I refused to become the solution to problems I did not create. I had learned the cost of being endlessly understanding. Evan's decline accelerated. Without firm boundaries or accountability, his mistakes compounded. Opportunities closed quietly. Relationships strained. My parents' belief that love alone could fix everything finally collided with reality. They were forced to confront a truth they had long avoided. Favoritism had not protected their son. It had weakened him. And neglect had not broken their daughter. It had sharpened her. The moment that changed everything came unexpectedly. My parents asked to meet me privately, away from Evan, away from familiar walls. We sat in a neutral space, and for the first time, they spoke without rehearsed optimism. They admitted exhaustion. They admitted fear. And then, hesitantly, they admitted regret. Not in the dramatic way, but in small, fractured acknowledgments that revealed how deeply they had misunderstood the impact of their choices. They asked why I had pulled away. They asked when it happened. They asked what they could do now. I answered honestly, without cruelty, and without comfort. I told them how it felt to be overlooked at dinners, excluded from vacations, treated as an afterthought because I was capable. I explained how being strong had become a burden rather than a blessing. I did not accuse, I described, and that distinction mattered. For the first time, they truly listened. They saw themselves reflected in my absence, and they did not like what they saw. I made one thing clear. I was not returning to my old place in the family. I would not compete for attention or sacrifice my peace to rebalance their guilt. I had built a life through effort and solitude, and I would protect it fiercely. If they wanted a relationship with me, it would have to be new, honest, and equal. They agreed, though I could see the weight of that agreement settling slowly. The power dynamic has shifted, not through confrontation or revenge, but through consequence. My parents face the reality of their favoritism. Evan faces the outcome of a life shielded from accountability, and I stand apart from all of it, no longer defined by comparison, no longer waiting to be chosen. What none of us fully understands yet is that the final reckoning is still ahead. And when it arrives, it will force each of us to decide whether family is defined by obligation or by the willingness to finally change. The hardest truth I learned was this: walking away did not immediately fix anything. Distance did not magically heal wounds or rewrite years of neglect. What it did was give everyone space to face themselves without my quiet presence cushioning the impact. For the first time in my life, my family had to live with the version of themselves that existed without me smoothing things over. After that private meeting, there was an uneasy pause. No sudden closeness. No instant repair. My parents tried, awkwardly and inconsistently, to include me more, to ask instead of assume, to listen instead of dismiss. Some days it felt sincere. Other days it felt like guilt wearing the mask of effort. I accepted what felt real and declined what felt performative. I had learned to trust my instincts again. Evan's situation continued to unravel, without my silent support and without my parents' endless belief shielding him. His failures became impossible to ignore. He missed deadlines. He burned bridges. He borrowed time and money with promises he could not keep. Each mistake echoed louder than the last, until even my parents could no longer reframe them as bad luck. I watched all of this from a distance. I had earned. There was a moment, one I will never forget, when Evan finally asked for my help directly. Not confidently, not casually. He asked the way someone asks when they realize the ground beneath them is gone. I listened carefully, and for the first time I said no. Not out of spite, not out of revenge, but because helping him again would have meant betraying myself. That no changed everything. My parents were forced to confront a reality they had avoided for decades. The daughter they ignored had become the most stable person in the family. The son they protected could not stand on his own. The imbalance they created had consequences, and no one could undo them now. I did not celebrate Evan's failure. I did not feel victorious. What I felt was clarity. His downfall was not my responsibility, just as his success had never truly been his own. Favoritism had robbed him of resilience, and it had robbed me of belonging. We were both victims of the same mistake, just in different ways. My life, meanwhile, continued to expand. My government career reached a point of permanence. I earned respect through consistency, not charm. My name became associated with reliability, integrity, and calm leadership. I bought my own place, I traveled alone, choosing destinations without compromise. I built friendships rooted in mutual respect rather than obligation. For the first time, my life felt like it belonged to me. Family gatherings changed shape. Sometimes I attended, sometimes I did not. And when I did not, I no longer felt guilt. My absence was no longer a statement. It was simply a choice. One evening during a rare full family dinner, I noticed something that finally confirmed how far things had shifted. The conversation no longer revolved around Evan. My parents spoke carefully, aware now of how imbalanced sounds when you can hear it clearly. When I spoke, I was listened to. When I stayed quiet, no one assumed I was fine. It was not perfect, but it was different, and difference mattered. As the night ended, my mother looked at me with a sadness that felt honest. Not dramatic, not manipulative, just human. She understood, finally, that the daughter she had taken for granted had built a life without her guidance, approval, or support. That realization carried grief, but also respect. I left that dinner without relief or resentment. I left with peace. The truth is this: I did not walk away to punish them. I walked away to survive. And in doing so, I became stronger than the version of myself that once waited to be chosen. My parents learned too late that love requires balance. Evan learned too late that protection is not the same as preparation. And I learned that self-respect sometimes looks like distance. In the end, I did not win against my family. I won myself. And that victory did not need applause, forgiveness, or validation. It only needed me to keep walking forward, stronger, quieter, and finally free. Were you ever ignored in your own family? Would you walk away like Natalie? Or keep hoping they would change?